Anita Alvarez killed the myth of the Black-Brown Alliance, and now all of Asian America is killing your pathetic daydream of any black-yellow unity. Some black people like RZA seem to think if they kiss Asian people's behinds, that will somehow mean something to them. Some black people think because they like Japanese cartoons or Chinese kung fu films that they understand Asian culture. I did a video many years ago explaining to these fools that unless you look at how Asians portray black people, you're only fooling yourselves. Some black people think because Asians emulate black culture, that means they respect us, when all it really means is people following a lesser culture gravitate towards a stronger one. Black culture distinguishes itself and defines. Asian culture doesn't. Inscrutable and reserved also means invisible and easily dismissed, which explains why the Asians are trying to get whites to let them stay under the umbrella of model minority, which to them means honorary whites. Immediately following the rightful conviction of the murderer Peter Liang, who killed Akai Gurley in cold blood, the Asians in at least a dozen cities have come out in total support of the killer. Before we go any further, let's reacquaint you with the facts of this case. Peter Liang and his partner Sean Landau went into the Lewis Pink housing projects in Brooklyn, even though their commanding officer had ordered them not to perform those kind of patrols and to instead patrol the exterior of the building unless they got a service call. They went up to the 8th floor and started milling about the stairwells. One of them had a light that was out, making it totally dark. Even though Liang had a department-issued flashlight, he didn't bother to use it, instead pulling his gun. All of this without any sort of threat being apparent. He could have used his flashlight, but he chose not to. He could have identified himself and made it clear he was a police officer, but he didn't do that either. Instead, he drew his gun and proceeded down the stairs. Akai Gurley was in that same stairwell. Liang claims that he heard a sound. To this day, his partner doesn't corroborate this, and neither does anyone else, but to hear Liang tell it, this alleged noise startled him. And even though, as he put it, he didn't have his finger on the trigger, the gun went off anyway. The bullet struck the wall right in front of Akai Gurley, the round ricocheting and striking him in the heart. Gurley's fiancée, having heard the murderer's gunshot, came out into the hall and found Gurley bleeding to death. A neighbor called 911. 911 dispatch talked Gurley's fiancée through CPR. Soon a ton of cops showed up, but no medical support. Gurley stopped breathing and died. And where was Peter Liang when all this was going on? Well, at first he and his partner were arguing about whether to call in the shooting or not. Liang couldn't care less about the dying man at his feet. All he cared about was whether or not he was going to get in trouble with the department. Then Liang decided to text his union representative. That's right. He got on his phone and started sending text to his union representative. Whenever an officer uses his weapon in the NYPD, standard procedure is to call it in over the police radio. All of those calls are taped. That's the reason why Liang decided to telephone his sergeant instead, because he knew that the police calls over the radio were taped, and he didn't want anyone hearing what they had to say. And what were Liang and Landau arguing about? They were still trying to figure out what their story was going to be. Liang fired a blind shot into a pitch-black stairwell without seeing any threat, without even attempting to ascertain if there might be one. The usual lie about "I was afraid for my life" wasn't going to work this time. So the two rookie killers were trying to figure out what angle, if any, they could play. Meanwhile, for over 6 minutes, the department had been trying to reach Liang, and he and Landau refused to answer. Because they hadn't gotten their story straight. They needed a lie, a good one that would place the blame for the shooting on Akai Gurley. But they simply couldn't figure out how to twist the circumstances into anything resembling a threat. The DA, a black man in this case, pushed for manslaughter, which is the appropriate charge, Asians, trying to use white logic, keep saying, "But he didn't mean to do it." Manslaughter has nothing to do with intent. It's simply about whether you did things that would have cost someone their life. Peter Liang did, both before and after he shot Akai Gurley. At the trial, the defense tried to gin up some phony sympathy for the murderer by claiming he was distraught and hyperventilating. However, witnesses who were there, when asked if Liang had indeed been crying or even having trouble standing, flatly denied that he did. At the trial, his own former partner testified against him, telling the world that Liang refused to call for help and instead wanted to argue that they shouldn't call the shooting in because he was worried about getting fired. Then, after arguing, they took still more time to decompress, whatever that means, but neither one of them tried to call 911, though Liang did contact his union representative. Apparently, they weren't in too much shock to see if the NYPD would cover their worthless asses. Landau also admitted they both had been trained in CPR, but didn't try to help. And to even suggest Liang was saddened after killing Gurley is a perverse lie. Given his clear contempt for Akai Gurley's life, does anyone truly believe that Liang would share a tear for anyone but himself? The entire time, the only person Liang expressed any concern for was himself. Gurley wasn't even an afterthought. When a cop finds someone who is injured, the very first thing he's supposed to do is to call for medical assistance. Liang didn't, not because he was unable to, but because he refused to. That's why counts 5 and 6 of the indictment charged him with refusing to perform a duty that clearly is inherent in the nature of his office. He knew he had murdered a man, and because he couldn't figure out a good lie, he was paralyzed with indecision. Now that the murdering bastard has been convicted and his corrupt partner has also been fired from the department, we find Asians protesting in several cities across the U.S. They are demonstrating in the tens of thousands. The way they're behaving, you would have thought the race killer Liang had been the one who was killed. Asians protesting in the tens of thousands for their right to kill black people and not be prosecuted. And it's no surprise that they use the exact same language as the whites who they worship. They even went so far as using pictures of Dr. King, a man who stood for nonviolence in a feckless attempt to garner sympathy for a ruthless killer. I warned you years ago how the Asians were trying to appropriate our icons for their own sick, selfish purposes, how they were attempting to appropriate Dr. King and pervert his message so as to co-sign their own racism. At these rallies, the throngs of degenerates had up posters with King's words on them, and the ultimate insult, they would chant, "All lives matter." They were clearly looking for a white audience's support, and apparently they found it.
But again, another example of our New York City police officers every day risking their lives to protect all of us. I believe that we are here to stand for justice, not revenge. Justice, not revenge. Justice, not revenge. Justice. I'm hearing that over 40 cities across the country are out there today demonstrating. If we vote in a unified way, you don't think people will listen? You don't think it's going to happen? I must say, I appreciate William Colton, Assemblyman, Councilman Mark Traeger. They supported us from day one.
The Liang gang was not the one who caused what happened to Akai Gurley. It was the lawlessness that existed in that pink houses. Peter Liang did not cause the drug dealers who were in those stairways and were allowed to be in there for probably years. He didn't cause that.
Talk about scapegoating, because it wasn't the drug dealers who killed Akai Gurley. It was Peter Liang who this scumbag claims had nothing to do with it. Now you see the level of corruption and racism that's behind this Asian American rally. Understand it. Patrick Lynch, head of the Police Malevolent Society and the most corrupt cop in America, couldn't resist throwing a few extra lies into the matter. He claimed that the pink houses are a war zone. But a former New York police officer, Eugene O'Donnell, who now teaches at John Jay College, says that's not the case at all. Quote, "Too many younger officers without the benefit of veteran partners seem to believe that patrolling public housing is like being in a war zone." When he says veteran officers, it needs to be understood that means officers like Pat Lynch, the very same old-line white trash who promotes such racist myths to begin with. O'Donnell then goes on to say the pink houses have some issues, but to depict them as some sort of bad old days location really isn't accurate. And considering that the NYPD itself says there's been a 28% reduction in crime, bears him out. So this isn't a case of cops being in mortal danger. White people keep pushing the lie that cops are fighting a war, when in fact they're goofing off and trying to figure out ways to abuse their position for personal profit. As I've been telling you for years, being a cop in America is one of the safest professions you can get into. And yet, even though the Asians themselves can't defend him, that hasn't stopped them from attempting to use the white playbook anyway. Since they couldn't blame the victim, they instead blamed the entire tenement building itself. If there hadn't been crime there, Liang wouldn't have fired into that stairwell, they say. That's like a doctor deliberately committing medical malpractice and then saying, if there hadn't been sick people in my hospital, I would never have killed any of my patients. The unspoken message is, you would have done the same thing. Never mind that Sean Landau, who was standing right beside Liang, didn't do the same thing, didn't even take his gun from its holster. So this isn't an issue of training. It's an issue of Asian and white culture. Speaking of Asian culture, I would like to say that this racist denial is limited to Chinese Americans, but that would be a lie. Asians in general, Japanese Americans, Southeast Asians, etc., are rallying around this. Every Asian political whore from New York to Chicago to LA is trying to find out how to appeal to their very base constituency. Asians figured they were white by association, or rather by aspiration, so what works for their white idols ought to work for them too. Except the whites are circling the wagons. Asian Americans are now scared. They thought they were on team white supremacy, and they're being confronted with the idea that maybe they're not. They're attempting to hold on to the white privileges they thought they had. That's what these pathetic protests are really about. The model minority is suffering from white anxiety. Because if Asians can be stripped of their honorary white status for the big things, what will become of them when they lose their honorary white skin privileges for the small things? Asians who come to this country set up their shops in black neighborhoods, making their money off of black residents. From restaurants to hair care, black people are stupid enough to do business with people who plan our eradication daily and are now carrying it out. Any black person who does business with racist Asians is collaborating in genocide. If Akai Gurley had been the one who fired into a darkened stairwell and killed Peter Liang, would the Asians be out in force claiming it was an accident? Because they sure didn't do that when Ishmael Brinsley was accused of killing Wenjian Liu in 2014. Even though Brinsley had a clear and long-standing history of mental illness, going so far as to try to take his own life and then shooting his girlfriend after she saved him, Asians still seem to be on a tear that what was clearly an irrational act by a disturbed mind was somehow clear evidence of malice. And Shirley Ng in the New York Post wrote a pitiful endorsement of Liang's murder, claiming that it wasn't a crime at all. What Liang did was not an accident, but Asians are desperately trying to convince someone, anyone, that it was. Let's count up how many accidents Liang had that night. because to let the Asians tell the story, he accidentally went into those tenement buildings, even though his supervisors said that they were not to go inside unless on a service call. He accidentally walked into what he could clearly see was a dark stairwell. He was so scared that he accidentally continued to go into the pitch dark stairwell without using his flashlight. He then accidentally pulled his gun. He then accidentally pointed it. He then accidentally pulled the trigger. He then accidentally didn't call 911. He then accidentally got into an argument with his partner for minutes on end about how they can't call in the shooting because he might get fired. He accidentally started texting his union representative, all while Akai Gurley's fiance is desperately trying to save his life, and neither Liang nor his partner are even attempting to help. And at last, he accidentally waited until after the residents in pink houses called 911 before he decides he better finally call in the shooting. Peter Liang had every opportunity to do what was right, and in every single instance, he deliberately chose to do what was wrong, repeatedly. These are not accidents. It doesn't matter how many self-serving Asian bigots take to the streets. We know who and what you are, and your ridiculous display of racism is fooling no one. There were a million ways Liang could have handled this that would not have resulted in anyone getting hurt, and he deliberately chose the one course of action that would. If Liang had used his department-issued flashlight, Akai Gurley would still be alive. If he had made sure there was a threat before he reached for his gun, Akai Gurley would still be alive. If he had identified himself, as the officer's manual says you're supposed to do, Akai Gurley would be alive. He did none of these things. Common sense dictates this is no accident. The Asians know this, but when your honorary white skin privileges are vanishing before your eyes, any port in a storm, I suppose. There's only one person to blame for this. Peter Liang. This wasn't an accident. It was reckless disregard, and the Asians know it. He didn't murder Akai Gurley out of fear. He did it because he could, and the Asians know that too. At best, Peter Liang is a lying coward, at worst a racist murderer, but in truth, he's all of the above. A liar, a coward, a murderer, and a racist. Peter Liang's mother says her racist animal that she unleashed on society wishes he had been the one who was shot. Well, he's not alone in that sentiment. He had plenty of time to correct that little oversight, and he still does.